unusual briefs. You were telling me about one beforehand that you might want to mention to our television audience.
The brief of the parliamentarians?
Well, and also the...
the brief of the lawyers.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's an extraordinary thing. President Bush, shortly after 9/11, issued an executive order laying down the rules for military tribunals to try any alien suspected of terrorism or harboring terrorists. No such tribunals have as yet been appointed. But they've sort of started setting up the possibility, and among other things, they've designated 5 military officers to serve as defense counsel. Mm-hmm. That's the way military courts work. Officers are there. And under the order, they could also go and get private counsel at their own expense. Mm-hmm. But any defendants who were selected for trial, none have been selected yet, but anybody tried, could pay their own money to get a civilian lawyer, if that lawyer could be cleared mm-hmm. for access mm-hmm. to classified documents, mm-hmm. or they can use these military lawyers. 5 of those military lawyers have filed a brief in the Supreme Court of the United States saying this system is fatally flawed because it forbids us to go to a civilian court to challenge things that happen under this system, and that's not right. Now, that was quite a brave thing for them to do. It's reminiscent, I was telling you, of something that happened during World War II. Quite amazing story I've just read in manuscript in a book that will be published, I don't know, maybe 6 or 8 months. Mm-hmm. It's about the case of the Nazi saboteurs who were landed by submarine in the United States during World War II. The case in the Supreme Court was called Ex parte Quirin.
And this is a very important precedent in the so-called enemy
yes.
combatant cases going to the Supreme Court now.
Because these people, A, 2 of the 8 were American citizens, mm-hmm. and B, they were tried by military tribunal. Mm-hmm. And military officers, one in particular, were appointed to defend them. And the one in particular was a colonel called Kenneth Royal, who later, as it happens, became Secretary of the Army. Mm-hmm. But during World War II, he was a colonel. President Roosevelt issued an order saying how this tribunal should be conducted and forbidding the lawyers for the defendants to go to a civilian court. Kenneth Royal, after his appointment, he's a colonel in the Army. The commander-in-chief has just issued an order. He writes a personal letter to President Roosevelt saying, "Dear Mr. President, you can't do what you just did. You can't forbid me to go to a civilian court. I'm going to go to the Supreme Court of the United States." The next thing he knew, he got a phone call from the President's secretary saying, "Come to the White House." He waited in the anteroom for 2 hours while the matter was discussed between the secretary and the President. He never got to see the President, but the secretary came out and said, "The President has given you your order." Royal then wrote another letter saying, "Mr. President, I am interpreting what you said to me to allow me to go to the Supreme Court."
Wow.
And he didn't get a further letter, and he did.
That's so inspiring. And see, this is why I have reason to hope from our independent bench and bar. Now, I want to ask about your other profession, that of being a journalist. I've heard some criticism from other journalists about the media coverage of civil liberties issues post 9/11. And of course your writings have been terrific, but in general, do you think the public is getting adequate coverage, fair coverage, adequate information about these issues?
No, I think that the press has been very slow to take notice of what's happening. There have been little stories about Padilla and Hamdi, for example, but maybe a few more thorough stories, but mostly little shorts, you know. When Hamdi, the first one, was arrested and held without access to counsel, I saw a story about that long in the New York Times, and I just was shocked. I guess I'm easily shockable, like Claude Rains in Casablanca. Anyway, Louis, I've forgotten his last name. Anyway, it's not a laughing matter. I thought it was very serious, and I just was amazed that it was that short a story. So no, we haven't paid a lot of attention. The public hasn't paid a lot of attention, as we were saying, and those two are related. The press doesn't operate in a vacuum. It tends both to inform the public and to reflect the degree of public interest in a subject or political interest. And members of Congress have not been terribly exercised about civil liberties, and that has had a role. The ACLU has, but maybe the press is not sufficiently attentive to the ACLU.
Oh, thank you very much. And one of your lines in talking about Congress's role was you described Bush as being able to work very well with a supine Congress. Although lately there has been bipartisan pressure in Congress, I think responding to the local community, resolutions that you
Yes.
referred to earlier to trim back the excesses of the USA Patriot Act. Well, I wanted to ask you, in terms of the press not adequately giving information, in fairness, the Bush administration has had many secrecy policies, in fact throwing an unprecedented shroud of secrecy over every aspect, or many significant aspects, of the post 9/11 investigations: secret deportations, secret hearings, secret arrests. In your experience over decades now, is this unusual? Is this extreme? Or is this, again, part of a pattern that goes all the way back to Woodrow Wilson?
I don't think it. I don't know what went on in terms of secrecy in the Wilson administration. I think it certainly is the height of secrecy in recent times, and it has been very strongly applied. I mean, you mentioned in passing one example, which I'll expand on a little, and that is that in the weeks after September 11, on the orders of Attorney General Ashcroft, the FBI arrested several thousand aliens in the United States. They were held without charge for weeks, and in many cases for months, in places of detention like the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. Their names were not disclosed. Their places of detention were kept secret. Their families didn't know where they were, and in fact, the Metropolitan Detention Center, when families got the idea that their husbands or fathers or whatever might be there and asked, said, no, he's not here, when in fact he was there. And some very terrible things happened to those people. We have to give credit. The Inspector General of the Justice Department, Glenn Fine, issued a report saying, they were brutalized, they were lied to, they were humiliated, they were kept in cells in solitary confinement with fluorescent lights on 24 hours a day.
They were thwarted in their efforts to get access to counsel?
Absolutely, yeah. So they were very badly treated, and all, as you said, under a cloak of secrecy.
Well, we have very little time left. I'd like to ask you one question on a different subject. You've written 2 acclaimed books about major landmark Supreme Court cases, Gideon versus Wainwright on the right to counsel, and New York Times versus Sullivan on First Amendment right to criticize the government. If you had time, which other Supreme Court case or cases would you choose to write another wonderful, in-depth book about?
I really can't answer that because it takes a lot to dislodge my, what shall I say, my spine, my sitzfleisch.
You're so prolific. I don't accept that.
Well, it takes a lot to get me to write a book because that's a different kind of enterprise. It takes, most journalists have a short attention span. That's our secret. We get all excited.
Readers do too, so you're a perfect match.
No, so there isn't a particular case as yet. I think, let's put it this way. If the cases we've been talking about turn out the way I hope they turn out, that would be a fit subject.
Oh, fantastic.
With some brave lawyers, too.
So that's another reason to hope for the right result. I probably have only 1 minute left, so I want to ask you a question about, you happen to be married to a Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court. Has that given you any different or added perspective onto the justices of the U.S. Supreme Court in terms of their role and their decisions and how they function?
Yes. My wife is Margaret Marshall, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts. The insight it's given me is how judges can disagree strongly among themselves. They decide the case, and then they go on. They don't hate each other. They go on and decide the next case in a congenial way. I could never do that. I couldn't be a judge because I'd keep thinking about the last case. Why didn't I get one more vote? You can't do that if you're going to be an appellate judge. You just have to keep going.
Okay, well that's very good to hear. But it's been an absolute pleasure to have the chance to talk to you. I know that our audience is very benefited by this extraordinary privilege, and I want to thank you so much, not only for being here tonight, but for your writings. I'm glad in some sense that you say you have a short attention span because you keep cranking out those columns, which are the antithesis of the general problem you described about the press not being attentive enough to our civil liberties situations. You are being eternally vigilant, and thank you for all of the information and all of the inspiration.
Well, I thank you very much for that. It means a lot to me, but I want to tell you, our freedom really depends on the lawyers and judges in this very law-oriented country.
And we're training them at New York Law School. Thank you.